Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 7 of the regular season for the San Jose Sharks. They took on the New York Rangers and won by a score of 6-5 in overtime. Had to bust out the noisemaker for this one. You might be thinking, just a 6-game losing streak, that's nothing for the Sharks, who lost 9 in a row last year and 11 in a row the year before that. However, when you think about it, despite the fact that the Sharks may have only lost 6 games in a row here this season, they did end last year with 11 straight losses, and so we actually haven't seen a Sharks win since late March of the 24-25 season. It's been 7 months, a long time coming, but we have finally arrived here, the first Sharks victory of the season, as they are now the last team to have picked up their first win of the year, but slow and steady wins the race, and this was definitely a very exciting game to watch. Starts out in the first period where the Sharks are playing very, very well to begin. They get an even strength goal from Gaudette for a second straight game here. That makes it 1-0 San Jose. Then it is Celebrini on the power play who makes it 2-0 off of a pretty lucky bounce goal, which is then responded to by the Rangers and by Taylor Radish with his own lucky bounce goal. That makes it 2-1. However, in the final few seconds of the first period, Celebrini scores, gives the Sharks back the 2-goal lead heading into the second period. However, as we know, the Sharks were never going to make this game easy. This wasn't going to be one that they just walked easily towards like a 6-1 victory or anything like that. You knew that the Rangers were going to make it interesting. You knew that this was going to be a nail-biter right up till the end. And indeed, in that middle frame, Zibanejad scores, Parsonen scores, Radish scores, and suddenly a 3-1 lead turns into a 4-3 deficit. However, to stop the bleeding late in that middle frame, it is anyone else it couldn't be besides Macklin Celebrini, who ties this game up at 4 and completes his hat trick, his second career hat trick for his, young career that only began last season. And so heading into the third period, the Sharks are in a tie game, but you could see that they were a little bit nervous at this point. They were basically playing to not lose this game over the final 20 minutes, while the Rangers were able to be a bit more free with it. Now, the Sharks would score to go ahead here, thanks to a almost full 2 minutes of 5-on-3 power play time. This goal from Smith would not end up actually being on the power play, but just barely, as both of these penalties would expire, but a power play influenced goal, as many would call it, to make it 5-4 before Radish would score his own hat trick, and that tied it up at 5. And then, as I said, the Sharks basically just hanging on, trying to get this game to overtime. But it's not as though that's necessarily a winning strategy for the Sharks, because they've already played 2 overtimes this season, and they lost both of them. In fact, it was their first 2 games of the entire year, and Warsofsky comes out with a bit of a different look to begin this 3-on-3 overtime, one that would have potentially backfired tremendously and would have faced heavy criticism had it gone the other way, as the Sharks start off with William Eklund on the wing, not that much of a surprise, but with Alex Wennberg at center instead of, who you would expect, Macklin Celebrini there. I mean, you would normally think that Celebrini would start the overtime in any case, but on a night in where he had 4 points, including a hat trick, it seemed like that would be the easy decision. But however, because of how those first couple of overtime games went, where Celebrini was either at least partially, if not directly responsible for losing those games, Warsofsky goes for a different look. Now, this does almost end up backfiring indeed, because it's not as though the Sharks play with any amount of possession for those first 30 or so seconds that Wennberg and Eklund are on the ice. However, they catch a bit of a break when Rangers goaltender Shesterkin makes a bit of a strange play, sends this puck directly up the middle of the ice, straight towards the Sharks goaltender Nedeljkovic, and he's able to get possession back for San Jose. He feeds it to Celebrini, who has now stepped onto the ice, and then we see some classic Celebrini-Smith magic that results in this overtime game winner and in this Sharks first victory of the season. As I said, it was an exciting game. It was a nerve-wracking game. It was back and forth. It always was going to be, but we can finally say that the Sharks have a win in the 25-26 season. Moving on to the players to talk about, the forward lines actually remain the exact same as they were in the previous game against the New York Islanders. Not too much of a surprise, because obviously the Sharks played well against that Islanders team, but what that does mean is that Philip Kurashev remains on the outside looking in. Everyone else remains in that lineup, and we'll start off with the top group: Celebrini, Smith, Tyler Toffoli. We talked about Celebrini, how he had actually put up a really good performance last game against the New York Islanders, managed to score a goal, but just couldn't quite get it done and couldn't quite get the team over the finish line there. And there was a lot of frustration, you could tell, with Celebrini by the end of that night. And that carried over into this game. He came in as a man on a mission. He was not going to lose another one. And so he pops off with the 5-point performance here tonight, with the hat trick here tonight, not to be denied, not to be caught up with great goaltending from Shesterkin, who came into tonight as the best goalie in the league thus far with superb goaltending stats. Celebrini takes this one over and wins this game for the San Jose Sharks. Obviously, we know Celebrini is not the captain yet of this team, but definitely a kind of captain type of moment for him, as he more or less does it all here tonight to get this one done. Was this a perfect game? It never will be, but Celebrini basically checking every possible box that you could want from him, and he was clearly the MVP for the Sharks in this one. However, relatively close to him was his buddy Will Smith, who may not have had the 5-point performance, but 4 points, as well as that overtime game winner. I was actually ready to come into tonight with a whole speech about one of the negatives, one of the weaknesses of Will Smith's game. However, feels as though that's not really going to be appropriate for the celebration here tonight of this Sharks' first victory. I'll get into it at a later date, maybe into another inevitable San Jose Sharks loss at a later date. However, right now, you want to celebrate what Smith is capable of doing for this team, the strengths that he has as a player, and it is that ability to find Celebrini wherever he is on the ice. It's that very good shot, some underrated shot that he is able to offer with that beautiful one-timer for the game winner onto Shesterkin in the overtime. This duo is outstanding. It is amazing. It probably never should have been separated this season by Warsofsky after those first couple of outings against Vegas and Anaheim, but it is nice to see that they are put back together, and I imagine at this point, I mean, a lot can change over the next 70 or so games of the year, but I imagine at this point, it's probably a lock for pretty much the rest of the season. Now, the third wheel on this line is Tyler Toffoli, who I do think had like a pretty good game here tonight. Certainly not that bad, but there are some worries about how Toffoli is going to be able to keep up with both Celebrini and Smith. He managed to do decently well here in this game. There was actually a very nice play by Toffoli on the third Celebrini goal of the night near the blue line to keep this one in and allow Celebrini to get that game-tying goal with just a few seconds left in the second period. But there were other moments where you see Celebrini or Smith trying to make a play and Toffoli just can't quite finish it off. There was one in the third period where Smith at the blue line, a bit of a risky move for sure, but he looks for a kind of a skilled play down the wall for Toffoli, who misses this and then creates a chance going the other way for the Rangers. Luckily, kind of an end of the shift for that player, and Orlov was able to angle him off, and so there wasn't much of a great chance that amounted to it, but it was pretty close, and you wonder if maybe a guy like Eklund is in that position that they're able to finish it off. And then we saw actually at the end of the first period, as Eklund is finishing up his shift, Celebrini and Smith come onto the ice. Eklund makes a nice play high up along the boards in the offensive zone, gets it to Smith, gets it to Celebrini, and that was a goal. And so you wonder if more so long term the Sharks might end up loading up that top line with Celebrini, Smith, and Eklund, especially to try and get Eklund going a little bit here at even strength. But right now, especially with this victory in their back pocket, I imagine this trio remains the same, and we'll see how Toffoli can continue to fare in this position. When it comes to the Sharks' second line, Eklund, Wenberg, and Skinner, definitely another kind of muted night for them. The first line was the one that kind of stealed the show, and so you were never really going to manage to compete against them. But at even strength, you definitely want to see more from this group that is rounding out your top six. When it comes to William Eklund, I mentioned it a couple of games ago, and it was on full display here tonight. That kind of inability sort of to be able to get off that clean shot continues to show up here for William Eklund on that 5-on-3. Actually, just prior to this Will Smith goal, you see William Eklund get set up for a really great one-timer, and then he just completely heals it. And this is not an unusual circumstance for him. And so you kind of hope that he would, really kind of improve in this particular area, because the Sharks actually do use him in this spot rather consistently. They don't do so on the 5-on-4 power play, but they do it on the 5-on-3 as well as the 4-on-3 power play that you would get in overtime. They like him in that position, and it has had some success in the past, but you want it to be more consistent. When it comes to the rest of his game, I thought Eklund actually played pretty well. Defensively, there were some shakier moments, but honestly was able to hold off the Rangers to a decent extent, I would say, and still managed to pick up 3 assists here tonight, which is very helpful because he only had 2 points through his first 6 games of the season. And for a player who, this was a very, very important season for him, you were definitely looking for more. Hopefully this is the beginning of a bit of a turnaround for Eklund, but you do have to mention that his line mate's not exactly doing him a ton of favors, which does bring us to Alex Wennberg, who I thought from a defensive standpoint wasn't necessarily terrible here tonight, but there's still really not much doing at all when it comes to offense, and considering this is your second line center position, you would like to see more offense from him. Then there was also the mistake that led to this Parssinen goal that originally made it 3-3 between these two teams. Yes, you could certainly argue that I think it is JT Miller who ends up knocking the stick out of Wennberg's hands, and that probably could have been a penalty, but this is still a situation where Wennberg is basically cutting across up high in the offensive zone, multiple different Rangers players who are defending him while precariously holding this puck. Yes, usually Wennberg is very good at protecting the puck in this situation, and maybe he would have pulled this play off without that interference from JT Miller, but this was still a really risky situation, and I imagine if this was not like a veteran guy like Alex Wennberg, he probably would have gotten significantly more consequences from the coaching staff for trying this move out. Like if that's Will Smith, if that's Michael Misa doing that, you're done for the night, more or less, or at least for the period. So Wennberg, not exactly looking all that great. And then when it comes to Jeff Skinner, there were a couple of moments in the offensive zone where I noticed Jeff Skinner and he was able to get a decent chance off, but not really much past that, and so there's not a ton to say about this particular player. When it comes to the Sharks' third line, as I said, all the lines remain the same, and so we once again get to see Graf with Misa and Gaudette, and as I mentioned, the second straight game where Gaudette is able to get an even strength goal, and it is once more off of the very impressive connection between these three players. Michael Misa holds off the Rangers defenseman, reverses this puck for Graf, who is able to find Gaudette in front, and Gaudette has that finish to be able to put the puck in the net. Very impressive to say the least. Now when it comes more specifically to Michael Misa, one might be thinking, well, I didn't really notice Michael Misa all that much after that first goal. I wonder what happened. Well, I don't think Warsofsky noticed him much either on the bench, because he barely ended up playing in this game. His just barely 10 minutes of ice time is second on the team amongst all forwards, again only ahead of Ryan Reeves, a good minute and a half behind guys even like Barclay Goodrow and Ty Dellandrea, and I know those two players do play shorthanded, and so when it comes to even strength, it is definitely a lot closer. But to see your third line center put up just 10 minutes of ice time here, especially since Misa does play the power play and gets at least a little bit of time there, it feels as though he should be getting more. Now at the end of this game, you're getting to those last few minutes of the third period and it's tied 5-5. I can understand the perspective of Warsofsky sacrificing a couple shifts here or there from Misa just to really try to get this victory, because I do think it is extremely important that the Sharks got this monkey off their back and that they're finally kind of able to relax a little bit and breathe that sigh of relief of how that first win was gotten. Because important to remember, last year when the Sharks lost 9 in a row, the moment they got that victory, not only did it lead to a 3-game winning streak, but the next 20 or so games on their schedule, they played about 500 hockey, and that only came to an end when the Sharks traded Mackenzie Blackwood. So this could be a bit of a turning point in this season. So I understand the importance of trying to prioritize that victory and maybe not giving Misa much time near the end of this game, but with how he had been playing and with the assists that he picked up and the assist he had last game against the Islanders, I still want to see him get at least a couple minutes more of ice time. 10 minutes just feels like way too low for a trio that has been playing quite well, so hopefully that does progress. Maybe because this is the first half of a back-to-back and the Sharks are obviously on this road trip, they're trying to ease Misa into it, but does he kind of really need this amount of sort of I guess, rest at this point? I'm not entirely sure. We'll see what ends up happening tomorrow if he plays in the first place and how much he does play if that does happen. When it comes to his two line mates, Colin Graf, again, very impressed with Graf here tonight. Just love the energy that he is bringing. It's kind of reminiscent to like how you would see a player like Macklin Celebrini, the energy, that kind of tenaciousness where he's just going after the puck like a dog going after a bone. Obviously, Graf lacks an immense amount of the kind of high-end talent that Celebrini Celebrini is able to bring, so you're not expecting Colin Graf to have many hat tricks and 5-point games, but he has that same type of element to him, which is very impressive, and it works very, very well in this particular position. And then Adam Gaudette, I already mentioned in the previous game, bit of a kind of outcast when on that top line, but on this third line, he has the scoring ability to actually get the puck in the net, and against weaker competition, the ability to find those soft areas of the ice. And so Gaudette ends up being a very important fit onto this trio that actually shows off great chemistry. Misa has the high-end skill, Graf has that kind of workhorse type of energy, and then Gaudette has the ability to finish on these plays. When it comes to the Sharks' fourth line, Dellandrea, Goodrow, and Ryan Reeves, I'll actually start off with Ryan Reeves, who ended up getting into a fight with Matt Rempe, which was probably the most predictable thing of the entire NHL season this year. You knew that these two were going to go square off. It was just a matter of time, and it only took a few minutes into this game for it to actually happen. Ryan Reeves seems like he got the better of this fight, though near the end when Rempe was like pulling the jersey over Reeves' head, it started to even out a little bit more, but I guess in the end Reeves does win because Rempe actually ends up leaving the game with an upper body injury. Reeves does end up coming back. I didn't hate Reeves' game tonight. He did throw a couple of hits that managed to do some good things for the Sharks in the offensive zone and keep the pressure on. It's not as though he's really expected to do much else besides that, so I guess it's a positive, and his 6 minutes of time on ice was all right. When it comes to his two line mates, Dellandrea and Goodrow, I was actually expecting a bit from Goodrow here in this game, because if you actually go back to last season, which was like a disaster for Barclay Goodrow, two of his only good games he had throughout that entire season, both of them came against the New York Rangers because it is his former team, the team that actually had put him on waivers, so I thought it would carry over into this season, but perhaps the kind of hurt feelings are no longer there, and Goodrow has kind of gotten over it a little bit, because I wasn't a big fan of Goodrow's performance here tonight. It wasn't terribly awful, but it wasn't particularly great either, and the same would actually go for Ty Dellandrea, though without, of course, the history of against the New York Rangers. This fourth line, it was okay-ish, but I have seen better from both Goodrow and Dellandrea thus far this season, and didn't quite see it tonight. When it comes to the Sharks' defense, two important things to mention. The first of which, no Sam Dickinson here tonight. Warsofsky says that this was not a performance issue for him, but instead because he has obviously played multiple games in a row, but now that someone is coming back from injury, Timothy Liljegren, that does allow the Sharks a little bit more flexibility with their defensive core, and this is the first half of a back-to-back, so they decide to have Sam Dickinson sit, and I imagine, especially with what transpired here this game, Dickinson will be in the lineup tomorrow against the New Jersey Devils. Do I agree with this decision? Honestly, probably not. I feel as though Dickinson is used to kind of playing a ton of minutes back in juniors. Obviously, juniors is a far cry from what you see at the NHL level, and playing 30 minutes at the OHL level is easier than actually playing like 10 minutes at the NHL level, but it shows that Dickinson does have that stamina where I think early on in this season he's not really going to get all that fatigued at this point, and so it just feels as though this was a easy decision for Warren Warsofsky to just get Liljegren back in and then to rest the younger player here. Again, hopefully he probably will be back in the lineup tomorrow. I didn't necessarily like this decision, but since it ends up being a victory, it's all right. The other thing to mention here tonight, while Leddy does end up playing to begin this game, he gets injured rather early on. Just a few minutes into this first period, he got maybe like 2 or 3 shifts in this game. He did not return after he takes, I think, a shoulder to the chin from, I believe, Will Cooley behind the San Jose Sharks net. Now, we don't obviously know how long-term or how short-term this injury could be. I doubt he's back tomorrow against the Devils, but theoretically he could be back maybe like on Sunday against the Minnesota Wild, or this could be a week, a couple of weeks, multiple weeks. We don't actually know, but looks like Nick Leddy could be out for the foreseeable future. Obviously, you don't like to see a player get injured, but I know a lot of people were hoping that Nick Leddy would end up as a healthy scratch at some point, and while it's obviously not a healthy scratch, it's a scratch nonetheless, and we'll see what the Sharks can actually do with their defense with him out. When it comes to who was supposed to be his defensive partner here tonight, we have Vincent Iorio. Now, obviously, with Leddy being injured early on, the defense, the other 5 players, have to take on a lot more responsibility. Iorio still didn't actually end up playing much ice time here in this game, but I did sort of like what I saw. There were some promising moments here in this game that let you realize why the Sharks originally picked up this player off of waivers and why they might actually have some hope into him becoming a pretty good NHL defenseman. There was this one exchange, I think back back in the first period between him and Celebrini that was very skilled and very impressive, that I was very surprised to actually see, because obviously I expected from Celebrini, who is incredibly talented, but I didn't expect to see that type of play from Iorio. But it really completely relieved the pressure from the Rangers' forecheck and allowed the Sharks an easy breakout moment. So I liked that from Iorio. There was another play later on where he was actually able to clean things up decently well. And so while the kind of decision making at times with the puck, there are moments where he's still giving it away, which is obviously not a very good thing. That is still a work in progress, and of course just generally fitting into this team. But with this only being his fourth game for this new organization, he didn't get to play training camp with the Sharks or get acclimated to the team in any which way at the beginning of the season, because obviously he was with the Washington Capitals previously. It's been some decent progress over these first few games. When it comes to the Sharks' second defensive pairing here, we have Orlov and Liljegren. To start off with Dmitry Orlov, obviously I have mentioned that it has been a very up and down season thus far for Orlov. He hasn't exactly looked all that great, and it was kind of looking like a bit of a, not necessarily a regret, but maybe somewhat of a mistake that the Sharks had brought him in, at least for as much money as they did. However, he has begun to settle in more. He was already pretty good a couple of nights ago against the New York Islanders, and I do think that did carry over here tonight against the New York Rangers. There are still some mistakes that you're just going to have to live with when it comes to Dmitry Orlov, and sometimes they might end up being pretty punishing and very dangerous types of mistakes, giveaways in his own zone and things of that nature. But honestly, he is beginning to look a little bit more serviceable as a kind of like top pairing, pseudo top pairing defenseman for the San Jose Sharks. And what I also was kind of surprised to learn with Orlov, and this was the case last game, he actually has been putting up some points here. He had his 5th assist of the night against the Islanders, and then here tonight he added 2 more to now be at 7 assists across the 7 games that the Sharks have played. I originally thought coming into this season that those would be the types of numbers we might see from John Klingberg, because I thought he would take on more of that offensive position. But with Klingberg not only being a very bad defenseman thus far this season, as well as injured this season, Orlov has instead taken on that title, and he has done a pretty good job in that area, so nice to see there. And then when it comes to Timothy Liljegren, as I mentioned, returns from his injury here tonight after missing the last couple of games. Liljegren had actually started this season off rather well, and so he had been a pretty important defenseman, sort of, for the Sharks' defensive core at this point. And he came back here tonight. He played a ton of minutes. I believe he led all Sharks defensemen in terms of time on ice for this game, and as such, he led all players for the Sharks in terms of time on ice this game. And I think he did a pretty good job. There were definitely some rougher moments, especially in the third period. There were some connections with Mario Ferraro in some of these double shifting moments since Leddy was out that didn't look all that great, which was somewhat surprising because obviously you would expect Liljegren and Ferraro to have a little bit more chemistry than that. But all in all, I think Liljegren was a decent positive player for the San Jose Sharks here tonight, and I think he'll continue to be rather important for this team moving forward, as he has shown up this season back in training camp, back at the beginning of the year, and done surprisingly very well. And when it comes to the Sharks' third defensive pairing, here we have Ferraro and Desharnais. That was pretty nervous coming into this game with this defensive pairing, because Desharnais worked well with Dickinson, because Dickinson is a solid puck-moving, fast, good skating defenseman, and while Ferraro has a decent skating ability, he's very far from being an offensive player. He, like Desharnais, is someone who's just going to whip pucks up the boards and hope that they manage to make it out of the zone. And so I thought we would see a lot of shifts in the D zone where these two defensemen would be completely trapped. However, because of the Leddy injury, we didn't necessarily see a ton of these players together. Like, this wasn't necessarily the go-to defensive pairing for this third group. However, when they were on the ice, it wasn't necessarily too pretty. Desharnais being forced to play significantly more ice time than he has previously this season. He's usually been on that third pairing with Dickinson, getting 14, 15 minutes a night. Now it's over 20 here, and we saw him get exposed occasionally for sure. There were some mistakes being made with some of his puck management skills, times where he was just not really able to keep up, but I think all in all he had like an okay, admirable-ish type of performance. The same would go for Mario Ferraro, where there were still those kind of Ferraro type of mistakes. There was one in the first period where he cuts across very awkwardly to try and keep a puck into the zone, which allows for like a 2-on-1 going the other way. Then there was one in I think the third period where he has all the time in the world seemingly in the corner of the defensive zone to make a play out of the zone, and instead of doing that, he just throws the puck up the boards and he ends up getting picked off by a Rangers player to sustain pressure in the defensive zone for themselves. So some mistakes for sure from Mario Ferraro, but you know what? The Sharks, they managed to pick up the victory. I don't want to be too hard on the team at this point for all of the mistakes they had made previously thus far this season. And in the end, you take a look at these 5 goals, and they're not hugely the fault of the Sharks' defense. The first Radish goal is an unlucky bounce. The Zibanejad goal is because of poor penalty killing. This is a pass that should not be allowed to get across the ice, but that's not the 5-on-5 even strength defense. The Parsonen one is off of that mistake from Wenberg, so not necessarily the blue liners. And then the other Radish goal shorthanded is on this 2-on-1 after Celebrini mishandles the puck at the blue line. It is really only the third goal from Radish that makes it 5-5 that you could argue that the Sharks defense kind of leaves Nedeljkovic out to dry a little bit, but otherwise, they bent, but they did not break here that many times this game. But when it comes to the Sharks goaltender, Nedeljkovic, he does manage to pick up the first victory of the season for the San Jose Sharks, so at the very least he does have that going for him, but this was not necessarily a great game from the Sharks goalie. He had played well in his previous appearance against the Pittsburgh Penguins, only giving up a couple of goals there, but here tonight he gives up 5, and I mentioned of course that the first goal from Radish is on a bad bounce, and then the Zibanejad goal is off of that cross-ice pass that he doesn't really have much of a chance to make a save on. The Parsonen one is also going to be a difficult one there, so those first 3 goals, not going to blame Nedeljkovic too much, but when it comes to this 4th and 5th goal, yes, Radish does have a pretty clear look at the net, but let's be honest, this isn't David Pastrnak, this isn't Alex Ovechkin taking this shot, it's Taylor Radish. He's an alright player, but he's not like some sort of guaranteed goal. This is the difference between giving up a set of goals to like Macklin Celebrini or to Colin Graf, right? Like, this is not exactly some elite sniper player, and you hope at these positions in the game where the Sharks have just had the game tied up against them 3-3, or when the Sharks have just taken a lead 5-4 off of a Will Smith goal, that your goaltender is going to be able to come up and make a big save for you, and he didn't quite manage to do that in these multiple moments. Yes, in the end, he does pick up the victory, and so you could say that he did enough to get this win, but the fact is that the Sharks are not going to score 6 goals every single game, obviously, and if the Sharks actually want to win some more games further down the stretch here, they will need some better goaltending from either Nedeljkovic or Askarov. I had mentioned earlier on that the Sharks last year, after losing those first 9 games, turned things around with a 3-game winning streak and then played some 500 hockey for a good month plus of time, but a big part of the reason for that was because Mackenzie Blackwood had kind of locked in and did some great things for the Sharks between the pipes. If Askarov and Nedeljkovic, neither of them are able to do that, this is just going to be a small blip of the radar for a bunch of losses here for the San Jose Sharks. So they will need a goaltender, one or the other, doesn't matter which one, to really be able to take the reins here as the starter. Perhaps you look towards Askarov, who at the very least had a decent performance the other night against the New York Islanders, to be able to do that, as he will be between the pipes tomorrow against the New Jersey Devils in the second half of this back-to-back. But somebody is going to have to show up. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action, as I said, tomorrow. They'll be taking on the New Jersey Devils, so it just gets difficult and more difficult on this road trip. Start off with a relatively easy matchup. There's no easy matchups in the NHL, but compared to most other teams with the New York Islanders, then you have a team like the Rangers here, who could theoretically be a playoff team, but definitely more so on the bubbles. And then you have the New Jersey Devils, who have been really good thus far this season. They are usually an extremely competitive regular season team up until the point where Jack Hughes inevitably gets injured. But right now, they've got a healthy squad. They're playing exceptionally well. And so that's going to be a very real test here for a Sharks team who will be on the second half of a back-to-back. I wouldn't be surprised to see the Sharks end up losing this game. I don't even think that would necessarily be disappointing, but as long as they can put up a decent fight, I'll be happy enough. Class dismissed.